So tell me, what is when foreign policy? What is the definition of like foreign? Like what would be the first paragraph of the textbook saying foreign policy?
So, how like I define it and how the most textbooks that I've used define it is like the programs and the policies that our government uses, or any government, right? But ours, in the context of what we're discussing, uses that dictate its relationship with other nations and other like non-nation entities internationally. So, like the United Nations or the Red Cross or like groups like that. More recently, the way that we conduct foreign policy and the way that we sort of have to do things regarding national security has changed, right? So if you think about, if you were a kid in like the 70s, you thought the real threat was the Soviets, right? And the potential of nuclear war, which, probably was very scary and very much a threat. But today, whether there's hostile governments, right? There's people we worry about, what is Iran going to do? Or what's North Korea going to do? But, or Russia. But really kind of the threat now is terrorist groups, right? So the way that we conduct policy is very different than if we're dealing with another country, right? And a government that, despite some problems, is relatively rational. If we think of like the height of the Soviet Union, like the leaders of that nation didn't want to, or empire, didn't want to kill everyone who lived there. And as, the United States, as, sort of intense as it could be, also didn't want everyone to die. So, that was also going to be kind of a back of their mind in the foreign policy that they conducted. Like, they don't want to take it all the way in using nuclear war, because that's going to, result in all these people to die, and they didn't want that. Terrorist groups aren't going to operate the same way, right? This idea of deterrence doesn't necessarily apply. So the way that we sort of shifted in the last, 20 years or more is very, very dramatic. And the way that we do foreign policy is a lot different.
Yeah. So what are some hot or interesting topics, and what are some interesting topics in foreign policy in terms of what we could talk about?
So I just kind of like was thinking about kind of how the Cold War really changed foreign policy, and then like how it's evolved since 9/11. So if you want to talk about that a little bit, and then we could talk about maybe some hot topics like drones or
something. So there's foreign policy since 9/11, and then that's how it sort of breaks. Well, talk to me first. What is the shift? What shift happened from 9/11 on forward? What's the before after?
So in 1991, the Cold War ends, right? You have the disbanding of the Soviet Union. There's an attempted coup, and they like dissolve the Soviet Union, remove themselves from the Communist Party, and become a democracy, of debatable strength, but a democracy, we'll say. And so that is going to fundamentally change foreign policy quite a lot, right? Because for the 50 years before that, give or take, that had consumed basically all the air in the room of the international community. Like the whole world was involved in this power struggle between the communist world and the quote unquote democratic world, right? Or the U.S. and friends. And there wasn't any room for anything else. And the United States, unfortunately, as a part of that, backed up all these governments that were not at all democratic, that didn't have respect for human rights, that did bad things to their people because they weren't communist.
Yeah.
I mean, and the Soviets, of course, did things as well, to expand their empire, as we're trying to expand our influence too. So, the whole world is occupied by that. So when the Cold War sort of ends, kind of abruptly, really, like, it kind of not with a whisper, not a
it wasn't very exciting. I remember being sort of a kid. I think I was in high school, but just hearing like my photography teachers like, did you hear about what's going on with those Eastern European countries? It was crazy stuff. But it was there was like no boom. It was just sort of like, oh, okay, it's just ending.
Which is kind of weird and a little anticlimactic, but after that, there's now all this space for things that the international community and the U.S. and friends hadn't been concerned with at all, for years, decades. And, there's all this space for these new countries that are becoming democratic, some, more so than others, both the countries that leave the Soviet Union, but also, all these, there's newly independent countries, there's the ending of some civil wars that have been going on for a long time, and there's kind of this wave of democracy. And as such, a lot of countries start to, including the United States, starts to devote more attention to human rights and democracy. So that becomes kind of a thing. It's like, like the dream of the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Like that, that now our foreign policy is going to be determined by this. We're going to still try to abide by helping our economy prosper and the doing things that comes along with that. But, there's now all this space to ending civil war, to, around the world, to creating real democracy. So, the United States really kind of upholds this. In 1991, there's the first Gulf War, which was motivated by more than just democracy, if you will. But, we really do respect the sovereignty of Kuwait and, remove ourselves from that situation when it's over. Don't go into Iraq and, help that situation with minimal kind of blood loss, at least for U.S. troops. We intervene in Somalia motivated by human rights. We intervene in the former Yugoslavia, particularly Bosnia, motivated by human rights. There's lots of interest groups and human rights groups and women's groups across the world, that are, calling on the United States to do something of the genocide and the, horrible things that are happening in that war. And the U.S. is, doesn't really have a financial stake in the game. It's not, really motivated by that. It really is kind of a humanitarian thing. So that is the, the kind of the dream of the 90s, right? This democracy, human rights, hooray.
Yeah.
But of course, that's going to fundamentally shift in early 2001 or late, whatever, 2001 with September 11th. And when that happens, now we have a fundamental shift in foreign policy. Ironically, 9/11 is also my birthday.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's not the best birthday.
Wait. So now I'm trying to think about how old were you when?
It was my 13th birthday.
Oh, wow.
So my parents were like, oh, okay, teenage years are going to be very fun for you.
Were you planning, let's go back to your birthday back then. Were you planning on having a party that day?
No, it was a Tuesday. So I wasn't planning on doing anything that day. And my parents are in healthcare, so they don't really they don't sugarcoat things very well, and kind of sometimes you wish they would. And so my dad was like, things are going to be different for the rest of your life. And I was like, that seems dramatic. And also a conversation we can have tomorrow. And he was like, we're going to go out for dinner, but we're never going to celebrate on your birthday again. And I was like, okay, tomorrow. So we went to Red Lobster, and we were there.
Wait, on your birthday?
Yeah, on my birthday that night. And there was only one other sad birthday family there.
Oh, wow. That's so sad.
It was. All the waiters,
were the TVs on?
The TVs were on at the bar. They were all standing at the bar and watching it. And then we were over in this empty part of the restaurant.
I feel bad for somebody who turned 11 that birthday. You have maybe 2 candles that look strangely like the Twin Towers, on fire.
I had never met anyone with that birthday before, but that week, for whatever reason, is the most common week to be born. It's a very... for whatever reason, it's 9 months from New Year's and Christmas parties and stuff.
Okay,
and
that
so
actually makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very common week to be born. But now, because elective C-sections and stuff, that day, that the 11th is the least.
Oh, they're just avoiding.
Yeah, they don't.
What day? Yeah, that's an
interesting.
That's an interesting thing. What day are we want this kid born?
But now I've met a lot of other people who that's also their birthday, but we all have different
you guys should start up a Facebook group, the 9/11 kids. Share your story, your birthday stories.
I'm sure there's people that were born on that day. What a weird day.
Yeah.
So this is gonna on top of being weird to be a teenager in Texas, it was a fundamental shift in our foreign policy. So now we're not concerned necessarily with human rights, although, when it's convenient, we're going to talk about that. But now it's going to be, this war on terrorism, right? So we're going to have a fundamental shift in sort of our priorities. Security, of course, is going to be a big thing. And, the way that we fight terrorists is going to be a lot different than, like, how we'd wage a normal war.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Bush administration is going to start to adopt new foreign policy sort of precedents, I guess is the way we could say it, like a new foreign policy doctrine. And we call it the Bush Doctrine. So, George Bush wasn't like, and now the Bush Doctrine, but this is what, we say after the fact. So he is going to advocate for use of a couple different things that are different. So the way that we root out, terrorists is different. So going to say that kind of directly targeting the enemy is permissible because of terrorism. So, in conventional war, it would absolutely not be permissible to, like, bomb a wedding, right?
I see.
But terrorists do, they're hiding. They're different. It's different. So, they're going to justify those sorts of acts. And it's not just George Bush. It's all the presidents.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it seems to coincide with the rise of drones. Like drone strike, you could follow a car. He's getting out of a restaurant. Okay, he's in a car. Hit the car.
And like other things that we wouldn't do, like if we were fighting, in traditional sort of warfare, like country versus country.
Mm-hmm.
And also the Bush administration, his foreign policy sort of team, is influenced by a couple different things. They're influenced by the idea in political science called democratic peace theory. So democratic peace theory says that democracies historically don't really go to war with other democracies.
Yes, I heard about that.
Which is relatively true, with a few exceptions. It's pretty true. But
what's the name of this theory again?
Democratic peace theory.
Democratic peace theory. That actually reminds me of almost a parallel theory about free markets and democracy.
Okay.
Like the whole idea was, China is becoming a capitalist country, and then they're going to gradually evolve towards a democracy or something. But that hasn't really panned out.
No.
But
makes sense, though.
Yeah. I mean, the idea was, how would it be possible to have a fully functioning modern economy while simultaneously having a ton of censorship and restrictions and stuff? And I don't know.
Sort of the exception to that, right?
Yeah, a huge exception.
Yeah.
But the democratic peace theory, is that
right?
Okay, that does seem to be borne out.
Yeah, I mean there are of course exceptions, but historically it's pretty true. But democracy isn't something that you can just like order on the internet, right? And be like, here, have this country.
Yeah.
It's something that kind of has to be organically grown, if you will, within that country, and it has to be sort of culturally accepted. So, the Bush administration starts to like put in democracies in countries, and they're not even really democracies. If we meddle in the election to have someone who's, an ally of the United States be their leader, it's not a real democracy.
Yeah.
So that it's a nice idea. We're never going to go to war. We won't have all this terrorists if we can just bring democracy to these places. But it's much harder done than said.
Yeah, I mean,
easier said than done, if you will.
The idea of a country that doesn't have the culture and the institutions.
Right.
But I do remember people saying that about Iraq, and I don't know. Are you up to speed with Iraq's state of democracy? Are they having regular elections that are not totally rigged?
I haven't done a ton of research this year, but last I heard, not so much. I mean, maybe more successful than Afghanistan, but
oh yeah,
as far as I know, not really.
Yeah.
So they're influenced by that idea. They're also influenced by this, the argument or thesis of a book called Clash of Civilizations.
Sounds like a video game.
It does sound like a video game. It is much less cool than a video game. So Clash of Civilizations was written by Samuel Huntington, who was a political science professor at Harvard. And this guy is not ideal, let's say. I'll say that kindly. He wrote a pretty good book about democracy that I don't hate, but for whatever reason, he just goes off the rails with Clash of Civilization. So his argument is basically that the Middle Eastern world and the Western world are like fundamentally incompatible. So one day they will come to blows, and it is like pretty easy to understand as far as like academic books go. So like I think it was pretty popular in the 90s, but then post 9/11, people were like, he predicted 9/11. It's like, did he though?
Oh, okay. So he wrote it in the 90s saying they're incompatible.
And that they're going to come to war, right? So if we don't fundamentally like change that part of the world, then there's going to be this coming like inevitable conflict.
Did he give a time frame?
He did not, I don't think. I mean, it's been a long time since I read it.
That's
and
all.
I probably wouldn't read it again, but it kind of made it seem like it was at the same time like imminent, like it's coming any day, but also like far in the future. So, I don't know. There might have been more specifics of the date in there, but I don't remember.
I mean, that's always the trick about making predictions. Anyone's going to throw out a prediction and just let it sit there for, a few decades or whatever. But
so the like Bush administration and like pundits and a lot of people who are prevalent in this foreign policy era, are very influenced by this idea. And now like most people are like, there's definitely been a reckoning on the book and him in general. And he wrote also a very racist thing in foreign policy that they published about like Mexican immigration in the 90s too. It's like, come on. So that's what they're influenced by, these ideas. So that's going to motivate our actions in a couple of different places. Of course, with Afghanistan, the invasion of that comes in October of 2001. The United States is mostly like supported in this invasion, right? I don't know if you remember it, like, most countries saw it as that it was justified because Al-Qaeda had taken credit for 9/11. They were hiding in Afghanistan. We asked the Taliban to hand over Al-Qaeda, and they were like, no. And so it was seen as permissible. But that when the Taliban falls within 6 months, we're like, hooray, we're just going to give them democracy. And
it was always like, what do we do now? We kind of killed a lot of the bad guys, but maybe not the head guy. And what do we do now? This country's now that in disarray. Right.
And even after, the head guy is killed, Osama bin Laden in 2011, like, we still don't have this like fundamental cultural shift that we were hoping for.
Cultural shift where in
Afghanistan, like
I see.
That we were a lot of the expectation is that we're going to be seen as liberators, right? That we're coming and like giving them this government, but it's not. It doesn't really happen like that. We're not doing enough on the kind of cultural front, right, and the social front to do that. And also, when we're kind of fundamentally not really assisting their economy in a real way, that's really going to hinder this whole process, right? If we're not replacing things in their government, in their country that are going to like bring in revenue that are going to support a lot of people, then that's they're going to have trouble with the rest of this sort of democratization and modernization of their economy. A lot of their economy is kind of subsistence based, and then also there's a big opium trade coming out of there when we're eradicating opium, which is lucrative. It's understandable, like, of course, like, this is super addictive and it turns into black tar heroin and like or whatever else that comes out of there, but if we're not replacing that with something that's also economically lucrative and viable and stuff, we're really not going to see this big shift.
I mean, I heard that part of it is the geography of Afghanistan lends itself to just having a bunch of little enclaves in different parts. I was thinking that maybe we should have, well, I guess 23 years ago, there wasn't enough of this, but I mean, ideally we would have handed out cell phones and just have them be connected to the rest of the world culturally in terms of the internet and social media, maybe, as well as all its ills. But
right?
I mean,
some of them are going to become like indoctrinated by like those Russians or whatever, but like that probably would have helped. It would allow like for more of the U.S. narrative to come through, rather than just the sort of narrative of like the Western world causing all these problems. So that certainly would have helped. I was going to say something else, but now it's gone. So that, it's not really the success that we hoped for.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people were sort of really, people were definitely disillusioned about Iraq and Afghanistan.
Oh, for sure. I mean, like, I don't know, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I feel like, even with hindsight, yeah, it makes sense to go into Afghanistan. But, I don't know how it could have been different, but
yeah, I remember everyone was on board with that.
Right.
I was in grad school at that time, and all my peace-loving liberal friends were like, let's bomb them. Everyone was pissed, right?
Yeah, it felt like a direct affront, and and this also sort of ties into the Cold War, right? That a lot of these Taliban officials, a lot of the Al Qaeda people had worked with the CIA to overthrow the Soviets in the 70s and early 80s when they'd occupied Afghanistan. So it's all coming back.
Yeah, I remember reading a book. I think it was written by someone anonymously, but it was about Afghanistan, and he was supposedly some CIA analyst, but it was his assessment about our ability to install a democracy there, and basically he was talking about all the challenges, and he just predicted failure.
He was right, I guess. And I'm sure that for people who were in the military, who went to Afghanistan, who served there, I know for the students that I've had that were in Afghanistan or had family there, when it falls back to the Taliban last 2021, I'm sure that was incredibly disheartening. It felt like all of that sacrifice, right? All the things that we did, were for nothing. So now it literally is almost immediately when we pull out, falls back to the Taliban.
Yeah, and I think before our pullout, I think it's almost like Afghanistan sort of kind of disappeared from the news. It's just something, because I don't think there was that many U.S. deaths or combat or anything like that. It was just sort of stable and then kind of forgettable.
Yeah.
And then when it sort of collapsed, everyone was like, "What was going on?" So.
Yeah, and and it's not one administration's fault. Those plans had been in place since the Obama administration, right? Obama, Trump, and Biden all kind of contributed to this change in our strategy in Afghanistan, and clearly comes to a head of Biden. So we'll have to see who the textbooks sort of point in this kind of failure. But yeah, not the success that we were hoping for. I guess we did eradicate mostly Al Qaeda. Does that count as success?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know isn't there and then wasn't there a different terrorist group that came out? ISIS.
Yeah.
Right?
ISIS, it was a little bit in Afghanistan. It was mostly in Iraq and Syria. So that was, the other thing, right, that the Bush administration does is the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So, that administration is really good at linking our sort of feelings initially of Iraq with 9/11, right?
Exactly.
Of connecting them in a way that, now we're were they really connected so much?
Well, yeah. Plenty of people, I think a lot of Republicans and conservatives became really disillusioned. I think there are a lot of young conservatives who are very much suspicious of foreign policy type intervention.
Yeah.
And they grew up in the wake of Iraq, and just kind of not really trusting the government and foreign policy.
Yeah, so, absolutely. And so it's kind of the same thing there, right? We when we staged this invasion of Iraq, the rest of the world is not so much on our side on this one, but there's this idea that we're going to be treated as the liberators, right? We're bringing you democracy, we're freeing you from this dictator, Saddam Hussein, and it turns out not so much, right?
Yeah.
Not really greeted that way. And when we oust Saddam and we don't have this kind of immediate success of democracy. I know, for a lot of people and then there's not even those weapons of mass destruction, right? That we were promised. Do you remember on the news, like they would be like, this is where the weapons are, and they would show like heat scans of buildings. And would be like, we gotta get them, right?
Yeah.
Turns out that not so much. So I also tell students, that remember how like every diner and like cafeteria they were mad at France for not helping us.
Oh,
and
yeah,
so
yeah.
They changed
the freedom fries.
That really shows them. We told you, France.
Well,
took French fries off our menu.
I mean, that was a huge contrast in terms of global perception from the first Iraq war.
Absolutely.
With the second, which is interesting that it's the two Bushes.
Yeah.
And I remember the first one, there was almost a unanimous worldwide agreement. I'm like, that's our oil. We can. And like Japan, and I heard Japan and Saudi Arabia were huge like financial contributors to the war. I mean, that's from what I understand.
It had UN approval as well.
Oh, yeah.
And
international troops and everything.
Well, and also because, surely there's oil, right? But, we were able to frame it as we're protecting the sovereignty of our ally and, their government there. And also, I think it was super popular because it was just this like quick invasion and quick, attack and pushed back Iraq, and then we were like, cool, goodbye.
Yeah, I mean, exactly.
Didn't get us involved.
Yeah, I mean, Bush Sr. liberated Kuwait and then basically stopped.
Yeah,
and that was
knew that going all the way to Baghdad was going to be bad.
It would create. It's interesting. You look at their reaning, and I remember reading a book about it. They're like, oh no, if we try to topple Saddam, the place will be chaos, and what are we gonna? And then fast forward 10 years.
Does the same thing.
Yeah, and it was interesting how there was obviously a rift between Bush Senior, maybe Bush Senior himself, but Bush Senior's advisors, and then Bush Junior's new wave of advisors, right? Who had very different ideas.
Different.
So.
And they're motivated by this different stuff, and I always wonder like what the relationship between them was, because there was a few things that the second Bush administration sort of undoes from the first. And like how good can your relationship be with that? The success is really of your dad's one-term presidency.
Where I always talk about it in economics class, because his approval rating went to like 90% after the Gulf War, but then the recession sort of dragged on, and then he raised taxes or something, and then
my lips now.
Yeah, so that was like a dramatic fall.
Right. And like, Bill Clinton was like such an unknown.
Oh, I remember that.
He had only been the governor of Arkansas, and like, generally that's not a very public figure. Was like kind of really unknown, and Bush Senior was so experienced. He was, an older president at the time. He had been in the CIA and been he'd been vice president for a pretty popular president for 8 years, had done all this stuff, and then suddenly have this like pretty young boomer. He was our first boomer president.
Wow. Yeah, back then boomer was young. We didn't use the word boomer, but that was a young generation. Look how young he is.
They did call them baby boomers still.
Oh, that's right.
Because it was like the post-war.
Yeah. It's a different connotation.
But,
30 years ago.
Older Congress people using it sort of derogatively young people, right? Like people use millennials for young people.
What generation were the pre-boomers? What do they have a name? Are they just the greatest generation?
There's the greatest generation, and then there's the silent generation. It's kind of like the people that were born like right before and during World War II, who were like too young to fight in World War II, and then you have the boomers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember.
So you have a lot of like those silent generation like at that time in Congress, and they're still holding on, some of them.
Yeah.
Fun fact, Joe Biden, not a boomer. He is, in fact, of the silent generation.
Oh, wow.
He is so old.
Well, we could do another show on that one, but okay. So let me see if I could put this foreign policy stuff into the right boxes. So we had maybe the post World War II. We had the Cold War basically. Up end of World War II. up until the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had this sort of weird era between the Cold War and 9/11,
Mm-hmm.
where you described that as we were doing some things to try to, you know, make the world a better place, humanitarian
Mm-hmm.
stuff. That was an interesting moment of
Yeah, of democracy, expansion of democracy.
yeah, that's interesting.
You have a lot of like countries in Latin America, adopt democracies. Nations in Africa
Hmm.
become independent from their colonizers and adopt democracies, and some stronger than others. But it really is this period of democratization. And you have the United Nations and you have the U.S. and a lot of other world powers sort of on board, right, for democracy, for human rights,
And peacekeeping, is that
peacekeeping.
Bush Senior's New World Order that he was referring to, perhaps?
The
It was,
of peacekeeping or
peacekeeping, world order,
yeah,
and then the spread of maybe international trade is, I guess,
yeah,
maybe that's what he was talking about.
and I think that also sort of harkens back to previous foreign policies of like imperialism, right,
Hmm.
of spreading the American values.
Hmm.
And so, along with that, that could be a trade, exporting our stuff to other countries, but it
Hmm.
can also be exporting like our ideas too of like,
Yeah.
here's this democracy, but also buy our stuff. And
Hmm.
like, our trade will all become interconnected. So yeah, I think that's a part of it too.
And then of course there's 9/11, and then the Iraq and Afghanistan, and then are we in a new era now? Like, so there was the 9/11, let's fight terrorism, and
Right.
then now are we in a new stage, and if so, or what do you think?
I don't think we're in a new stage quite yet. So, with Obama, he pivots from this like, Bush doctrine foreign policy and has this emphasis on like negotiation and collaboration and like working with the UN and stuff. But a lot of the things we're doing are the same. He is definitely not stepping back from drone warfare. He's,
Uh-huh.
Mr. Drone Strike
Uh-huh.
himself. And doing that a lot, the ways that we're operating are very similar. And,
Hmm.
the Arab Spring kind of gives people this idea like there's going to be all this democracy, and it doesn't really work out like that, right? And that unrest and the power vacuum of us leaving Iraq causes the rise of ISIS. So then we get back
Mm.
involved in Iraq. And then he wants to kind of pull it out of Afghanistan too, but this instability is keeping us there, and we're still doing the sort of same things. And then you have Trump, who campaigns on this America first, right? Let's not care about these international
Hmm.
organizations, and let's not get so involved in what they're doing. Let's pull out of the Paris Accords. Let's do all this stuff. And he wants to pull it out of Iraq, and he wants to pull out of Afghanistan too. But it's they're sort of doing the same things. It's the drone strikes. It's the I was gonna say something else. And he still has the, remember that Moab, the mother of all bombs
Uh-huh.
that we
Uh-huh.
dropped on Afghanistan? That was a big deal.
Hmm.
It's still the kind of same stuff. And then they start, and we do airstrikes in Syria too, and it's the same sort of goals that don't really go anywhere. And then we pivot from that like a little bit with Biden, who talks about restoring diplomatic relations and all of this. But, it's sort of the same stuff, except for now we've pulled out Afghanistan. But, there's still presence in other places. There's still kind of security concerns. There's still, concern about terrorism, I think is going to continue to sort of motivate our foreign policy. And especially when we're talking about regions that have a lot of resources that we need
Hmm.
for our industrialized economy, and that the rest of the world needs too. So because we're also interconnected, if we
Uh-huh.
find ourselves in a situation where like Europe doesn't have energy, that's bad.
Hmm.
And so that's really going to motivate this too. I think we're going to have presidents, just like during the Cold War, right? We have presidents that care more about maybe democracy and human rights than others do.
Hmm.
But I don't think there's been a fundamental shift in like what our agenda is and what our goals are, which is both good and bad, right? We don't want to like completely pivot, but it's also sort of demoralizing that no matter who's president, it seems for the last 20 years, like we're sort of doing the same thing.
Hmm. How much does American policy, I don't know if the word pivot is right, but I'm going to use it, pivot towards China in terms of,
Ooh.
like, I mean, I would imagine that whatever the latest stage when it comes would be all these issues revolving around China, both economically, militarily, and in terms of that. Is that has that been going on, or do we expect it to heat up more?
So I think that we've had a lot of very fundamental and like dramatic shifts in our foreign policy with China. So if you think like all the way back to the 1800s, when we have our first sort of waves of immigrants from China, or in Asia in general, mostly coming from China, you know, we're like happy to take them as workers, but then we're like, thanks for building our, you know, railroad. Please get out. Or the Chinese Exclusion Act, blocking them from citizenship, and this kind of like hostile sort of situation with them, you know, beginning, and that's 1881. And then during World War II, we were like, you are our friends fighting the Japanese, right? And they're our allies. So we quietly repealed that law and have this good relationship with them during World War II, because we're, you know, using them to fight the Japanese in the Pacific War, and, you know, we consider them our ally, and they're a victor of World War II as well. We give them a seat on the Security Council, and then they're a friend, right? But what happens in 1949? They have the Communist Revolution. And we were like, that's, you know, the Cold War is kind of kicked in by that point, and we're like, how dare you? So we kicked them out of the Security Council.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we will refuse to let them take their seat because we don't recognize the People's Republic of China.
Oh, that's right.
Taiwan takes that seat.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, for 25 years until the Nixon administration.
25 years.
So when the Nixon is like, China's got a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
So then we were like, you know, we'll open up our relationship with them. That was our bad about the whole thing. So then we kicked Taiwan out. Sorry, Taiwan. And we
kick Taiwan off of the Security Council.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
And we don't really recognize them.
Were they called Taiwan?
They took the Chinese seat.
Okay, so it still said China, but run by people from Taiwan.
You know, it was the Taiwan. That's who we recognize as the formal China state. But now we don't recognize Taiwan as the China state. We recognize People's Republic of China. You know, and allow them to take that seat on the Security Council, and we open up trade with them and all that. And so that's a pretty big shift, right? In this foreign policy historically. You know, that starts in the 70s when we have the kind of thawing of the Cold War a little bit. We the détente, Nixon foreign policy, and then, you know, throughout the 80s, it kind of remains in that situation. Like, we do business with them, but we're critical of some of the things that they do. You know, the Tiananmen Square, of course, we're very critical of that. But, you know, there's been an effort to sort of maintain that economic relationship as best as we can. So, yeah, like, certainly in the last couple of years, we're seeing this kind of growing tension between these two superpowers, because clearly, like, we, you know, need to acknowledge that they're nearly to that level of a nation, both in population, both in, you know, military strength, but in you know, development in the economy and all that. Yeah. So I don't know like what the answer is necessarily, or I don't know enough really about their kind of geopolitical like situations there to have a real feel for kind of what is coming, but you know, I think that we can kind of expect this to definitely sort of dictate a lot of our foreign policy going forward. You know, and things are clearly like escalating with Russia as well. You know,
absolutely.
We're fundamentally kind of at odds with them, and we've taken steps to formally, you know, sanction their economy and stuff. So, like, you know, that's a thing too. But they still have a seat on the Security Council too. So now they have 2 votes.
The thing about Russia is when Russia does something, it makes the news. Like they invade a country, like, okay. And China, they're not really invading in that sense. They're using more of their economic influence in sort of a gradual, in a very in a very, you know, substantive but gradual manner. But that doesn't necessarily, you know, make it into the news. Right.
Well, there was like you know, their actions in Hong Kong. I think, you know, like, however long ago that was, it all runs together. But, you know, I think sometimes we do hear about things that they're doing. But yeah, I think, you know, there are certain actions that they're taking certainly to spread their ideology, their influence, their values, you know, that are a little bit quieter than that kind of quieter imperial power. That, you know, we definitely are going to be a little hesitant to embrace. I don't know where I was going with that. Feel fearful of, I guess.
Yeah. All right. So we're out of time, but we did a lot of covering everything from the Cold War up till whatever the next stage is, or the stage we're at of foreign policy. So Karina Lovas, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right.